All right, ESG and the assholes trying to shove it down everybody's throat. This is something I'm hearing more and more about. And I talked about it before in a video where I talked about electronic ID tags and how those will eventually be used to track greenhouse gas emissions of all cattle. And the USDA is trying to force that. And then I saw that here in the Farm Credit Services, which is one of the biggest ag lenders. It's in their sustainability report. They're kind of pushing this ESG idea. And so I thought I would try to look into it more and lay it all out there. And so what it is, environmental and social governance is ESG. And it's an idea that was created by the United Nations, and then it was picked up by these three investment firms, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and they are the ones really pushing it. And those three investment firms, they control almost as much money as the entire US GDP, and they also are the top shareholders in pretty much most any publicly traded company you can think of. And so how it relates to agriculture mainly, or the cattle industry in particular, is the E part, the environment. But the truth is, if you really look at it, they don't really give a shit about the environment. The only thing that they care about is carbon and your carbon emissions. And so I just read a quote from an Alex Newman who said, every aspect of your life creates carbon, including living and dying. So the end goal with the whole ESG thing is control. And they would have control over your business and eventually your life. And if they can control every aspect of your life, you know, if they can control carbon, they can control every aspect of your farm or your ranch or your life, really. And that is the end goal with ESG. And so in the cattle industry, those three investment firms are the biggest shareholders in Tyson Foods, which is the biggest beef processor in the U.S. And Tyson Foods is all in and pushing this ESG idea. Cargill's also all in and pushing. They have their ESG report and the whole webpage promoting it. And so the way it works is, for the environmental part, is there's a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And what scope 1 and scope 2 is all about those shareholders controlling the greenhouse gas emissions of that corporation that they own the shares to, which is in this case Tyson Foods. Scope 1 and scope 2 is about their own carbon emissions. But what scope 3 is about Tyson Foods customers' carbon emissions and their suppliers' carbon emissions. And in this case, in the beef industry, that would be the entire cattle industry, is Tyson Foods' supplier. And what Tyson Foods is supposed to do is push this scope 3 down the supply chain to where more, and then their supplier adopts it, their supplier adopts it, and eventually the entire industry is controlled by this program. And so what we have now, I talked about in that last video, Adams Land and Cattle has partnered with Tyson Foods, and a lot of these big corporate feed yards. When I talk about a cattle feeder or a corporate feed yard, that's the last place that cattle go before they go to the beef packer. And it's just dry lots of where they're being fed hay and grain in a feed bunk. And these corporate ones, Adams, I believe, backgrounds and feeds out 250,000 head of cattle, so 250,000 head of cattle. And it's just another corporation, really. It's ran by suits in an office, just like any other corporation. And if you've ever driven by one, it's just miles and miles of dirt lot, dry lot cattle. And so they have partnered with Tyson Foods, and a lot of the other corporations are partners as well. But Adams has partnered with them in a specific line of beef called brazen beef. And their claim is that this beef is created using 10% less greenhouse gas emissions, or creating 10% less greenhouse gas emissions, which I think is a bunch of BS. I don't understand how they can make that claim, but they went to the USDA, and of course, because the USDA really just works for these corporate ag companies, they gave them the label, said they can use the label. And they also gave them $60 million. USDA gave $60 million taxpayer dollars to Tyson Foods just to implement these low carbon this low carbon beef. And so now you have Adams Land and Cattle, who's the next step on the ESG. The corporate cattle feeders now they're all in on the ESG. And in this this Farm Credit Report, there's an interview with an Abram Babcock. I think a lot of people maybe think I'm grasping or creating some sort of conspiracy theory here, but if you really look into it, that's definitely what it's about. And Abram Babcock, president of Adams Land and Cattle, says, big business driven by consumer and investor demand is making decisions based on environmental, social, and governance, ESG, and our supply chain partners are affected by ESG. As an industry, we have an opportunity to get ahead of this and demonstrate how we are getting better. That is why we decided to engage. Now, obviously, if you look into it, that's a bunch of BS, because the reason they decided to engage was because they're partnered with Tyson Foods. Tyson Foods shareholders tell them they have to do it. Tyson's getting $60 million from USDA. You know, it all just kind of works its way down. And this entire interview is all about how they were tracking greenhouse gas emissions, and they were trying to get a grant, some government grant for, they're partnered with Farm Credit. But anyway, at the end of the interview, he says, I think there also will be a time when the market is going to force us to demonstrate these things. And what he's talking about there is Scope 3. A time when the market is going to force you to demonstrate these things. And when you think about that, he doesn't mean that the market, like you're not going to be able to make money unless you demonstrate those things. He's going to mean you're not going to be able to sell your cattle unless you have your own ESG report, you're tracking your own carbon emissions and reporting them and trying to reduce them. And that's what Scope 3 is. And that's how the market would force you to do it, is you're not going to be able to sell your cattle to Tyson Foods unless you do it. And that is stated in the Tyson Foods ESG report. And eventually you wouldn't be able to sell them to Adams Land and Cattle unless you do it. And then eventually it works its way all the way down the line. And so that is, you know, it's kind of a bummer to see this in there. Farm Credit, I don't believe, it says partnering with our customer owners. And I think that's their main shareholders are their customers. But to see that they're promoting this, and that's one of the things the investment firms have really focused on. They're definitely the main shareholders in all of the big banks. And I think they're already doing this in Europe, to where if you don't have an ESG report and you're not trying going by the rules of this carbon emissions, then you're not able to get, you don't get as good a rate on your loans if you're not tracking and reporting. And eventually I think you're not going to be able to get a loan is part of the plan if you don't do these things. And so I think it's really important now, as this is being promoted, to really realize what it is and to try to stop it. And then the other ways, Adams Land and Cattle is a big roundtable for sustainable beef is what they call it. And there's a U.S. one and there's a global one, and Adams Land and Cattle, I think, kind of runs the U.S. one. And it's all about carbon emissions and that's the other way they're coming in and promoting it, is through that. And they get their ranchers in there and tell them what great people they are and how wonderful they are for trying to be ahead of this and trying to get on board with this thing. And it's really kind of an ego stroke, but in the end, what they want to do is really to get them to submit to these regulations and this ESG plan. The other way it's being pushed in the cattle industry, the first place I heard any of these kind of terms, where the terms are, if you hear carbon neutral, net zero, SDGs, which is Sustainability Development Goal. The first time I heard one of those was, I think, at least as far as the cattle industry, was, I think it was 2021, after the National Cattlemen's Beef Association convention. They came out, and this is back when the market was going crazy and it was going in the dumper, and there was cattle guys going broke left and right. And the National Cattlemen's Beef Association came out and said that their main priority was to be carbon neutral by a certain, I think, 2040, 2050, something like that. And what that is a sustainability development goal, and that is straight out of the ESG playbook. That is just promoting the ESG plan. And so when you hear those terms, you really need to know kind of where that's coming from, and where it really comes from is trying to get you under control, to control your operation. And if you really want to get nuts, you look at what the ESG plan says about beef, and there's more and more people are talking about this ESG thing as it kind of gains traction, and all of them, very few, pretty much none of them have anything to do with the cattle industry, but they all talk about how one of the main focuses of this plan is to get you to eat less meat. That's the whole. If you've heard anything about these bugs, and like you're supposed to get your protein from these bugs, they're actually building food processing plants that are going to make meals out of bugs and make food out of bugs, and so that's one of the plans. And so if you really look into it, all right, so let's get nuts here. You just go to Google here, type in ESG report beef. First thing comes up is this esgreport.com. And this is where you go to when you want to learn all about ESG and fill out your own report, and they tell you how to do it and everything about it and how wonderful it is. And so here you have what is the environmental impact of meat, and then it tells you all of the horrible things that meat does to the planet. Greenhouse gas emission, energy intensive process, requirement, large amounts of land, biodiversity loss, land degradation, all a bunch of BS. Human rights abuses, land grabbing. Oh, then they want you to sign up. Eliminating wildlife. And then here, how can you reduce your impact on the planet? Reduce the consumption of meat. There you have it. And so what that really shows is just the power and the influence that these shareholders have. They control these corporations. They're telling the biggest US beef processor to push this plan, which one of the main focuses is to eat less meat. And they're doing it. And and then it's working. They're working their way through the industry. They've already gotten down to a cattle feeder who's promoting that in this farm credit, this report here. And so what really needs to happen, or the industry needs to think about, is are you going to comply? Are you going to go along with this and give up control of your operation and go along with this deal, or are you going to fight it? Are you going to fight to remain independent and not submit to these things? And one thing about being here is you can look at Europe and see where it's already what has already happened. If you heard about the Dutch protests last year, and I was kind of like, well, what is this all about? The whole thing is about carbon and environmental restrictions and regulations. And over there in the Netherlands, this has been going on for years, and the farmers have been going along with it. That's one of the main things to remember, is that they have compromised. They have tried to work with the government. They have done all they can to go along with these regulations and restrictions. And now what happened in the last year or so is they've gotten to a point where they just realized they can't continue to be in business and go along with this stuff. And so that's why you've seen all the protests, and the government has come out and says, well, if you can't be in business, then we'll take your land. And so it's become obvious kind of where this whole thing ends. In the UK, there's a plan. They have crazy livestock restrictions, and there is a plan now, I think in Scotland, to euthanize, or it's been proposed to euthanize 180,000 head of cattle, just to reduce their carbon emissions. Like, the whole thing is such insanity. And so really it's important to realize that right now is the time where you have to stop it, and you have to push back, reject the entire idea of net zero, carbon neutral by a certain date, any of that crap. When anybody comes to you and tells you with their sustainability reports and telling you that you have to put together a sustainability report, you tell them where to shove their sustainability report. Farm credit, I know there's a lot of really good people that work at Farm Credit. I know there's probably a lot of really good people that work for Adams Land and Cattle and Tyson Foods and all of these companies I mentioned. And I guarantee they probably hate this stuff just as much as you or I do. And when you push back on it, I'm sure there's a ton of people working at those places that are going to love it. That they probably wish everyone would push back on it, and they can be done with the the whole thing. So that's where we are. And that's what this is all about. If you ever hear about ESG, that's what it's about. It's about controlling you and controlling the environmental part for sure. It's controlling your life and your carbon emissions. The social part, John Deere. I'll eventually talk about the social part, which is the S, and John Deere has. Their main investors are BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They have lost their mind on this social issue deal. They make Bud Light look pretty tame. So stay tuned. Share it. The other way, really to push back on this thing is to be informed about it. Do your own research. Go look it up like I did. And if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. But I've really looked into a lot of this stuff, and this is the way it's definitely headed. So share the video, like, subscribe, all that crap. See you soon.